from what we call the wise men, the magi, the religious scholars in Matthew 2, that they had come looking for the one who was born King of the Jews, not appointed King of the Jews, but born King of the Jews, because they had seen his star in the east. Herod not only had baby Jewish boys 2 years of age and under killed, Herod also, listen to this, Herod also executed several members of his own family, including his wife, Mariamne. This is the politician Luke mentions in the opening verses of his gospel. Herod, the politician, appointed by the Romans to be king of the Jews, appointed by those who did not like Jews to keep them Jews in their place in the Roman colony of Palestine, which included Syria, Samaria, Galilee, and Judea. Luke says, in the days of King Herod of Judea. And those are the images that leap to the minds of the hearers of those words. In the days of King Herod of Judea, a politician who hid behind the law based on the people whose laws discriminated against non-Europeans, a politician to whom and for whom black bodies were disposable. They were not persons to be treasured, they were pawns to be trashed, women to be disrespected like Doris, women and boys to be used and discarded like Antipater and Mariamne, whose teenage body was usable, but whose older age body was disposable. Black lives did not matter to Herod. This is the politician that Luke mentions in the opening verses of his gospel. A politician who was a pragmatist. He did what he had to do to stay in office to secure his throne and to silence any and all opposition, even those he was supposed to be one of, though that was questionable, and those he was supposed to be king of. That was clear because the Romans said so. This is the politician whose name, character, and reputation Luke juxtaposes next to the name of a preacher whose character, reputation Luke carefully describes in detail. Look at the text. Zechariah, the preacher. Zechariah came from a long line of preachers. Zechariah was a part of the priestly order of Abijah. Now, just that name means Abijah. God is my Father. What a sacred name. The Afro-Asiatic culture, to use Dr. Kane Hope Felder's terminology, and the classic African civilization culture, to use Dr. Asa Hilliard's terminology, both of those cultures, like my parents' culture, my grandparents' culture, and some of y'all's grandparents' cultures, placed a lot of importance on names, the family name. And what you do and how you act is a reflection on your family, because you're carrying the family name wherever you go. Names are chosen carefully, and names are acknowledged communally. Later on in this text, later on in African culture, and late and as recent as in our time, a child's name biblically and in West Africa is given on the 8th day in a ceremony involving the community. Some names, like the name of John in today's text and the name of Jesus later on in this same chapter, those sacred names are given while the child is still in the womb. Wherever you go, you're taking the family name with you. Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor had our doctoral class laughing uncontrollably as Dr. Proctor told us the story about how he came home from college for a semester break right after he had made Kappa Alpha Psi. You've heard this story. You know. He said he came home, he had this tenderoni all picked out. He had his line well rehearsed. He put on extra cologne, had his fine new pie pen in the label with mischief on his mind. And on his way out of the door, his mother said, "Samuel, step here for just a moment." Straightened his tie, looked him in the eye and said, "Wherever you go tonight, and whatever you do tonight, remember you're still a Proctor. You carry the Proctor family name with you wherever you go. And whatever you do, Samuel said, upset him, somebody just went back upstairs and got undressed and got in the bed. In Dr. Proctor's family church, the Bank Street Baptist Church of Norfolk, on the second Sunday of April in 2008, I had a different iteration of that same principle. I was there to preach. And during the service, all of a sudden, everything stopped. The interim pastor, they had no pastor serving there, then the pastor had died. The interim pastor stood at the pulpit, and he was just standing there. Music was playing softly, and I kept looking around to see what they were doing. No offering was being lifted. No dance ministry was getting in place. Service just stopped while music was going on. And then finally I saw an elderly woman in her 90s making her way slowly down the aisle on a walker toward the pulpit. And I said, oh, maybe she's going to make an announcement. So I went back and looking at my bulletin, looking at my Bible, looking at my notes. And while I was looking down, the minister sitting next to me said, she's calling you. She was standing at the edge of the pulpit, and I looked up at her. She said, you, come here. So I walked over to her, and she said, ain't you Mary Henderson Wright's boy? Ain't you her only boy? I thought I recognized that name from 1938. Family name. She was Randall Robinson's mother, and she and my mother had been at each other's wedding in 1938. Family names. Names are chosen carefully. Names are acknowledged communally. The faith community knows you by your family name. And the family name, the priestly name, the sacred name, Abijah. Now, we pronounce that J in English, but in Hebrew and in Aramaic, to say Abiyah was to say, Yah is my father. Yah, the shortened version of the tetramegram, YHVH, Yahweh, Yah. God is my father. Zechariah was a part of the line of preachers called Abiyah. God is my father. And the text said he lived up to his family name. He was righteous before God, and he lived blamelessly according to the commandments of the Lord. His wife was a descendant of Moses' brother Aaron. Her name was Elisheba in Hebrew, Elizabeth in Greek. The God of my oath, or my God, Eli. You know from 7 last verse, Eli, Eli, Eli. We say Eli, Eli. It's Eli, Eli. Eli, the God of my oath. Eli, 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 my God. Shabbat, satisfied. Reverend Clyde, Pastor Moss, there's a whole sermon right there in that name. The name given to her by her family. My God, Eli, satisfied. Sheba. She too was righteous before God. She too lived blamelessly according to the commandments of the Lord, because my God does satisfy. And the preacher and his partner, I want to submit to you, are placed in the same verse with the politician whose life was a direct opposite of their lives for several reasons. Luke juxtaposes a politician who hides behind the laws he makes up, with a preacher and his partner whose lives demonstrate the alternative of love. And the addendum that Luke tacks on in verse 7, where the preacher and his partner don't have any children because Elizabeth was barren and both of them were old, that addendum teaches us that you can live in accordance with God's word, but that is no guarantee that life is going to turn out like some picture-perfect fairy tale in a storybook. Zechariah and Elizabeth did not have everything they wanted, nor did they have everything they prayed for. Now, later on in this text, God shows them and us that every prayer request delayed is not necessarily a prayer request denied. But for many of us, if not for most of us here this morning, the important lesson is given in verse 7, which is why I stopped us reading there. Many of us do not ever experience a verse 11, 12, and 13 and following in this story. Our story stops right at verse 7. There is no change in our situation And the lesson that the preacher and his partner teach me is that you don't change your commitment to God just because God doesn't answer your prayers the way you wanted God to answer your prayers. You don't stop living right because life ain't done you right. They didn't get what they wanted, but they kept on living lives that were pleasing to God. I just scattered the ashes of my sister Cynthia in the Pacific Ocean on Friday. Cynthia lived a life like Zechariah and Elizabeth's life. But her story also stopped at verse 7. She was stricken with multiple sclerosis in 1980. And for 34 years, she prayed like these two for a change in her situation. But her situation only got worse. Bedridden for the past 10 years, she never stopped smiling. She never stopped praying. She never stopped helping others. Several members of our own congregation, Brandy Williams, Hillary Lofton included, she never stopped hoping. I was with her the night before she went into cardiac failure and into intensive care the next day. I was there. I was the last family member to see her before her body shut down on her completely. And on her last day, her last lucid day, her last conscious day, we laughed, we joked, we talked about the Bears, we talked about the 49ers, we talked about jazz. She loved not only John Coltrane, Pastor Mo, she loved the Japanese pianist Keiku Matsui. We talked about worship services. I was in Oakland that Sunday to preach the 95th anniversary of the Allen Temple Baptist Church, and she could not come to the service. She had been unable to get out of bed for the last 10 years. So after service, I went to her home, and we talked about the service. She has video streamed our Sunday services since we started video streaming. When you hear Pastor Moss speaking to that video stream congregation, those are real people. She used to watch us first on TV One every Sunday, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning West Coast time so she could worship with us when we came on television. She has been a tithing member on disability since 1989. A tithing member with multiple sclerosis in bed. For Rochelle and Linda and Mike and Aaron, Nichelle, I got a new way to lift the offering. When you stand up, say, give like you want to live. You want to live prosperous, you want to live large, give like you want to live before God makes you start living like you've been given. Cynthia was a tithing member. Cynthia loved to worship. Cynthia last saw me preach when she video streamed our stewardship revival back in September, and Freddie Haynes and I were preaching together. On the third Sunday in October when I was in her home and in her town, she said, I wish I could have come to church because Allen Temple does not video screen. I laughed when she said that, and I told her, Cynthia, you've already seen and heard the sermon because I preached whosoever in Oakland, and you heard it when I preached it at Trinity. She then went on to tell me what the points were in my sermon. And we laughed together, and we basked in the love of God that we shared together, with me not knowing that that day would be our last time together. We talked about Ferguson, October the 19th, and bedridden with strong faith and a 40-year career in corporate America, Cynthia said to me on October 19th, you know them white folks ain't going to indict no white cop for killing a black teenager. She never stopped smiling about the goodness of God. She never stopped praying about the power of God. She never stopped helping others because of the faithfulness of God. She never stopped hoping for the mercy of God But she never stopped telling the truth about how humans fell short of the glory of God. She